when my students had to present their research to their peers and to the school board and to the principal, they had to stand in front of like a tripod and be like, hey, this is what I did my research on. This is why it's important. And a question that they had to answer for everyone is, how does this relate back to your community? That was the hardest thing they did all semester. And they all said that. Not the research where they could have like pumped it in or copied and pasted an abstract. No, it was like relaying that information into a natural audience of people who would be impacted by the change that you want to see. That was hard. That was rigorous. And it was amazing.
Hello and welcome to episode 171 of the Human Restoration Project podcast. My name is Nick Covington. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this episode is brought to you by our supporters, three of whom are Skylar Prim, Kimberly Baker, and Timothy Fox. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support. At the time of recording, New York Magazine had released an article titled, "Everyone is Cheating Their Way Through College: How ChatGPT Has Unraveled the Entire Academic Project," which launched 1,000 takes. The piece outlines an arms race, characterized as a, quote, siege on education, between college professors sneaking white text Trojan horse prompts like mention Dua Lipa to confound the chatbots, and students, one of which is quoted as saying, "The ceiling has been blown off cheating." One ethics professor elaborates to add that, quote, massive numbers of students are going to emerge from university with degrees and into the workforce who are essentially illiterate, both in the literal sense and in the sense of being historically illiterate and having no knowledge of their own culture, much less anyone else's, which captures, in my opinion, the overall tone of the piece. That college is an expensive and fixed game that students endure on their way to credentials, and that institutions are powerless in a losing battle to stop. Education and learning have little to do with it. But it's also a chicken-egg issue where institutions of higher education are themselves contributing to the same attitudes they're complaining about. If students copy-paste a prompt from Blackboard into the chatbot, copy-paste the output, and submit it all to be read and graded by an AI, whose problem is that? My favorite take on the topic of AI in education is a satire meant to be read in the bulldog diction of philosopher-provocateur Slavoj Zizek. That AI will be the death of learning and so on, to this I say no. My student brings me their essay, which has been written by AI, and I plug it into my grading AI, and we are free. While the learning happens, our superego satisfied, we are free now to learn whatever we want. This is all to say that the conversation with my guest today, Texas educator Chanea Bond, was prompted by all of this. As she shared the New York Magazine piece with the challenge, "Somebody invite me on your podcast to talk about this article." And 3 weeks later, here we are. I'm hoping today to get Chanea's insight on the impact of AI in education and so much more facing teachers, students, and schools in 2025.
My name is Chanea Bond. I just finished literally this week, my 10th year as a teacher. Thank you. I'm so excited. My kids all clapped, my students all clapped at the end of the last day. I am a composition, American literature, AP literature, and all of the high school literatures teacher in Texas. And I became a teacher because law school was too expensive.
That's a good a reason as any.
That's kind of how the cookies crumbled. But but 10 years in, it's my favorite thing.
Yeah. How in the last 10 years has school changed since you became a teacher? And I don't know, what would you attribute those changes to?
Something that I think about often is that I was like a tech person in my first few years. I was that person that everyone came to. I was one of the first group of teachers at my school to go one-to-one with devices. So every time a student walked into my classroom, they would pick up a device and they would get to work and everything was digitized. And that was kind of how I entered into the field, with this really awkward shift between things happening on pen and paper versus things going digital. And I bridged that gap for a lot of my colleagues. And so my job in the beginning was like training on tech tools and different ways that I was like updating my classroom. And now 10 years in, I spend a lot of time having reverted almost completely back to pencil, paper, my composition notebooks. I ordered blue books for the first time. I didn't even use blue books in college. So it was very strange for me to be like going back to, I guess, the good old days, but the days where I could guarantee that my students were writing and I was reading their thoughts.
Our social media connection goes back to sort of that golden age of edu-Twitter. And I think we all sort of rode that wave, right? I think being connected to, being a Google certified educator and all these other things in the 20-teens and the early 2010s was a good way to sort of get some sort of prestige and training, frankly, in tools that at the time I think were novel and impactful in the classroom. What do you think prompted the reversion for you?
I mean, it's AI. It's AI. It's the ease and accessibility of artificial intelligence, and the fact that students have gotten their hands and computers on it and have figured out a way to kind of bypass a lot of the thinking that, at the very least, I think in the spirit of our classes are set up to do.
Okay, well, let's get into it then, shall we?
Okay, yeah.
Because in that intro, I tried to provide listeners some context for the New York Magazine piece about AI. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes in case anybody hasn't seen it or read it yet. But what was your initial reaction upon reading that? And has it changed at all in the weeks that passed? Or do you have any other additional thoughts now that we've had some time to reflect on it?
So I think it was probably this time last year, I sat for an interview with Edutopia, and I don't know if you remember that, but it was a huge deal because I posted a fraction of my syllabus that said, if you use AI, you will get a 0, no questions asked. The spirit of it was, I'm here to help you get better at writing and thinking. And if I'm not reading your writing and thinking, then I can't do my job, and you definitely haven't done yours. So AI will receive a 0. I was flooded for so long with commentary and questions and a desire for follow-up. What did that look like in my classroom? And so this entire year for me has kind of been me throwing ideas at the wall to see what sticks in regard to actually getting my students to engage with their writing and their reading in an authentic way. And so this year has been kind of been like my pilot program for what it looks like to attempt to ban AI in my classroom. And so when this article came out, it was at the end of this year where I have worked and struggled and, fought the AI battle valiantly, I think. And it was, when I first read it, I thought it was kind of funny and flippant. I didn't understand why someone would write an article like this and publish an article like this. But the more that I think about the political landscape that we're living in and the people who are given power in our country, specifically right now, the more it makes sense that this kind of, I think his name is Roy, this dark horse figure would emerge from academia, having never written an essay and never thought or never engaged critically with the assignment. And that would be applauded in some spaces. And when my students read it, they were like, that guy just told on all of us. That guy just told on all of us. Yeah. And they were mad, but there was very little, there was not I had like kind of a moral opposition, and they were just like, I can't believe that guy's a snitch. So that was really interesting.
That is so fascinating. You were saying before we hit record that you had students annotate that New York Magazine article.
I did.
What was their reaction upon reading it? Did their faces turn red when they realized that the student was snitching on them? Did they find this was an accurate portrayal of their landscape? Did they say that the work in your course was different because of the policies and conversations that you have had and put in place?
So just to answer that last question, they did say the work in my class is different. And not because of anything I've done, except I know them. I know them so well. And so the basis of my anti-AI policy is the fact that they write all the time in front of me, and I'm their thought partner for so many of the assignments that we do. And so anytime someone attempts to like turn in something that is not their voice, it is immediate to me. Like I can pull up 5 or 6 things and I'm like, this is what you wrote in January. This is what you wrote 2 days ago. Why does this sound so different? And so we have gotten to a place where they're like, I used AI, or I wanted to use AI so badly because I didn't understand, but I didn't, and now it's a mess. And so there's a level of like honesty that's come. And again, the fact that I know them and I have tiny classes. But when they were reading this article, I think something that happened is that they admitted that this young man talks a lot about a bunch of different things, but he didn't talk about like the desperation and the shame. I don't think that any of my students were at the point where they were like, yeah, I'm just using AI because why not? And I'm only here to meet my partner and a wife and a future like person to start a business with. None of my students were there. None of them mentioned the desperation and the shame. So many of my students are using AI not because they don't think that they can do it, but because they don't have time and they don't have energy, and they've often expended all of their mental resources. And so something that I learned, this came out a couple weeks ago, right after their final was due for our college course. And I think they were all frustrated with Roy because they were like, that's not what we're doing. We're doing this because we literally feel like we're out of options. And so that taught me a lot about scheduling and the way that like my assignments are like stacked on top of these other things. So I'm thinking about like how to reimagine that. But my students were definitely a lot more vulnerable, I think, and they didn't think it was as heroic or cool. They definitely admitted to this being true, but the spirit of it and the reason for it was very, very different for them.
Yeah, there was like a student shaming element of that piece that really rubbed me the wrong way because they seem to have found the villain that they needed for the narrative in in the one student that they got those quotes from who, was sort of deceptive, manipulative, knew exactly what they were doing to game the system, and then they project and elaborate that upon the entire student population to say, because of kids like this who are cheating and gaming the system, ignoring, right, what you're saying here, the fact that education, high school, college, whatever, has become incredibly high stakes. It's become incredibly stressful. Kids are burdened with more and more school and more outside of school work, extracurriculars, work, obligations to family than I think they have before. So kids kind of see that as a lifeline, to say, hey, instead of falling behind in my schoolwork to meet these other responsibilities that I have, I can let AI take that burden off me for a moment, just so I can get by in that aspect of my life. There was no sense of empathy towards why students would look to these tools in the first place. And it seems like that's what you found when you were actually having honest discussions with your high schoolers.
Yeah, there's another person that the article writes about, Wendy, and they paint her as someone who is like so silly. She doesn't even realize like how ironic it is that she's using AI for this like paper about like thinking. And that felt really icky too, because these are kids, right? These are kids, and for the most part, their prefrontal cortexes aren't developed. But my students thought that was really kind of gross too, because they are like, we know that AI doesn't sound like us, and we know that we are doing this out of desperation, but we're not like doing it. They said we're not stupid. And this article kind of paints kids as these like passive consumers of what they're putting on the page. And at least for my students, they're not. Again, unless it's desperation, they don't just sit and decide, okay, I'm going to use AI and I'm going to like throw it in there and see what happens. It really is a decision that they're making because, like you said, they feel like they're out of options. And so this article was mean spirited and I think that because we're educators, right, and the core of who we are, we kind of got they're attempting to do this thing where they're like painting the students as the problem, when in reality, we've got, yes, education as a business model. And those of us who are reading this who are not teachers are like, oh my gosh, these kids are gaming the system. And it's kind of valorized. I don't know. There's nothing, it doesn't jive with the reality that I think that most people are in. I think that both of the people in this article, both of the students are very privileged. And I know that for my students, we've had to talk a lot about their voices, right? What does your voice even sound like? What's your contribution? What's your offering? Something as a teacher that's so important to me. Most of my students are Black and brown and from spaces that are historically impoverished and marginalized. And so when they first come into me, it's something that myself and my team, we value a lot is, what is your voice? What do you have to say? And so with the students that I had this year, I've had them for at least 2 years now. And so yeah, when they do use AI, for me, it's like, this isn't your voice. This isn't what you sound like. This isn't your idea. And that is not a moment of shame, but just a moment of disappointment, because I'd like to think that I have cultivated a space where like I value their voice. And that's a lot of the feedback that I get, but it's also one class, with one teacher cannot undo years of systematic, undervaluing of those voices.
I think as class sizes bloom, classes are bursting at the seams. Kids fall through the cracks. They don't have relationships, perhaps, with other courses and educators who can have that relationship and feel like they can call them out on voice. What about a science lab, where it's not about stories and, your tone and your use of language, but solving a science problem or math problems, right? I can pull up the math problem solver app on my phone, point it at my paper, and just have it do the math for me. But I went back and pulled the article up, and I'm seeing here that Roy is a freshman student, Wendy is a freshman student. And I think about the adults and the systems here who should be building systems differently, building relationships, providing alternative models. And so to say, no, it's the fault of these 17 and 18-year-olds who are new to this campus experience and environment. Oh, they're the problem because they're using these tools that, society is not only encouraging, the institutions of higher ed, are adopting as labor-saving devices. And as you had mentioned, too, as one of the reasons why you refuse to have student participation in AI tools, how entrenched they are with our current political moment where we're seeing, democratic backsliding, very quickly a rise of sort of a technological authoritarian movement. And so to distance, students from that too, I think is a huge adult responsibility. Anyway, the article just seems to completely absolve the adults who build these systems, who build
Yes.
AI tools, and the companies that are pushing them in every single human experience. So have you gotten pushback either from students, from colleagues, or from school for, essentially putting up a shield, right? Or I don't know, do people think you live in a bubble or putting your head in the sand because you're not having kids use these tools?
Nobody who works in my building, like the people who work in my building, the people I work with we are aligned in that regard. And outside of my building, in these spaces that we share, you and I, it is a lot of pushback. You're burying your head in the sand. You're not setting your students up for the real world. When my Edutopia article was published last year, I got a lot of pushback from other Black and brown educators telling me that as a Black woman, I wasn't doing my due diligence to students of color because I am attempting to shield them from, the ways in which AI is going to make them better workers. And to that, I say, pshaw. No, I'm joking. But really, I think that's dumb. I can't imagine a world in which we need to make Black and brown students closer to workers in a capitalist society. And that would be my job. I just can't. That's not why I do this. And so that took some time to unravel, because I was like, am I doing the thing where I am telling students not to use a calculator? Am I that teacher? And the reality is no, because my job is to help students think and articulate. And even when we use things like Grammarly, that is changed and altered. And when you're changing and altering things before you even know how you got there and what you're doing and what makes sense, then you are changing the chemistry of what goes on the paper. And then you're changing the way that your brain processes information. And so I don't know, I feel like it's kind of it's like my sacred duty to help my students get that, yeah, these tools are out there, but like being able to think without them is going to be the skill. It is going to be the thing that companies look for. And I also take issue, I'm sorry to all of my friends who are listening to this, with teachers who are like, bringing AI in the classroom, we're bringing AI in the classroom. Every other professional development that I am at is about using AI and leveraging AI. And I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm like, the parents in Dirty Dancing who are like, don't do it. No, we can't do it. I feel like I'm almost like, no, we're not going to do this. But I feel like it's so important for students to have the skills that they need before we start to change their ability to get those skills, right? If a student doesn't understand how to brainstorm, putting them on a machine that simulates thinking does not make them better brainstormers. And it changes whatever ideas that they've had, and it formulates it into this like pattern of thinking, this algorithm that is developed by someone. It's almost like translation, right? It is subject to what machine you put it in and what words that machine is utilizing. And I don't know, I just feel like it's such a dangerous game. And I feel like in 10 years, we're going to see the types of students, the demographics of students who are heavily reliant upon AI are going to tell us something about that we already know, right? This is just speculation. That's going to tell us something important about what we meant when we said students needed AI.
You had said that, it changes the chemistry, it changes the audience, changes the way that you're going to write and express. If I know as a student, I'm writing for the audience of the robo-grader, well, right, what does that mean as far as my voice and my expression? What kind of feedback and relationship am I building with the computer? If I know it's just going to go into Grammarly or a Canva AI or Blackboard AI, but if I know I'm writing for the audience of Mrs. Bond, right, I know she's going to care and give me feedback, or I'm writing for my peers, or I'm writing for this kind of audience, right? Then I can not only take ownership, but like responsibility for the things that I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it, how I'm going to communicate with those people. Pairing that with how you said you've gotten the blue books back out that you did. I never used those in college. It was kind of on the cusp of having the laptops open the whole period. But how has your classroom practice then changed from the Google Classroom certified ed tech guru of your past self in an earlier version of your career to the one that now is slowing down, maybe being, less efficient, right? In rebellion against these tools that prioritize efficiency and speed and accuracy. How has that changed your day-to-day and your relationship with kids?
I have to be so much more present in my classroom now. And that's not to say I wasn't before, but it is easy to open up someone's Google Doc and be like, oh, you're doing great. And oh, you're doing great. Or here, this is what you're doing on the Jamboard. But now I have to walk around. I have to sit with students. I have to read what they're writing. I have to parse through these like weird, difficult sentences. I have to read their handwriting, which is like a whole other skill I didn't even know that I needed to develop as I was going into the classroom 10 years ago. But I have to be there and be in the moment with them. And something that I started doing this year that I haven't done in a really long time is that every single thing my students write, I write with them. Every single thing. I have my own journals. I have a set of pens that I use when it's drafting time. Everything, even if it's an outline, I draw my own outlines. I model everything. So this year, everything that happened in my classroom, I was building as it went. And something that I learned is that there were assignments that I was like, this sucks. We're not doing it. This was great when you were typing in a Google document. This was great when you guys were, doing different things in regard to like hyperlinking. This was great when it was an analysis activity that I expected you to do digitally, but now it just doesn't work this way. And like, that's okay if the mission is voice and thought and critical thinking. Like, and that was okay. But there were times mid writing something, I would just like tear the page out of my journal and I'm like, we're skipping this. We're not doing this. The biggest change that took place in my classroom is that I think that we as a society and as a profession, especially following the COVID outbreak, we're very much into talking about SEL, social emotional learning. And I think that as we came out of those initial years, right, so many of us, myself included, were rushing back to rigor. I have to, you know what, I have to stop talking about your feelings. This isn't just vibes. It's about rigor. And I definitely said that like 2 years ago. I was like, this class is not vibes. It's so vibes. I am vibes. This is who I am as a person.
It sounds like vibes, Chanea.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of vibes. It's a crap ton of vibes. And it's so funny. But I was like, you know what? We're going back to rigor. We're doing the things. And this year I had to go back to some vibes. And what I realized is that there's not a difference. Like those two are intertwined, especially for me, right? So the first activity that we do in all of my classes is who are you? It's an identity map. It is a, writing. It's grounding ourselves in who we are. And then again, talking about how are these parts of my identity intertwined in what I'm writing and how I'm analyzing what I'm reading. And what I realized this year is that, yeah, it's not what I was doing before was never just vibes, right? It was, I couldn't articulate it and I hadn't thought it all the way through. But now that I've like seen it happen and I've seen my students do really, really hard, rigorous things, and they leaned on parts of their identity and parts of their understandings of themselves, that made it so much easier to say, hey, I know this isn't your writing. What happened? Or, hey, this isn't your voice. Or even just asking, why are these different? Where is Sally in this? Where are you? You like something happened and you're lost in here. Where am I seeing you? And then that opened up conversations about the desperation and about the fear of doing it wrong or the misunderstandings from me, right? I thought you wanted this. And so this is what I wrote. What I realized, especially this is my first year teaching composition, is that when we were writing personal narratives, it was super easy to be like, no AI, we're writing everything down. But when we got to the academic, when we got to we're analyzing sources, then students were like, oh, well, now it's AI. And I'm like, no, because like I need you to be a part of this conversation too. And so we had to take a huge step back and we made slides about different facets of our identity. And every reflection piece after that was, where are you in this piece of writing? Where are you in your analysis of this text? What about you shows up? Where can I point to your identity here? And that makes it so much harder for them to get away with using AI. But most importantly, that makes it so much harder for them to, not be honest with themselves about what we're doing here and what the point of it is. And so I said that the biggest difference, but the biggest difference is that I had to explain to them why we were doing the things. Something that I think that high school, as a college instructor and someone who works with juniors and seniors in high school, I don't really have to do a lot of explaining of myself. I haven't in years past, right? There, I'm just going to do what you want to do. But that leads itself to this like obedience pattern where it's like checking a box instead of doing thinking. And something that I think that our colleagues in higher ed and in even in the higher rungs of high school need to think about is like, why are you doing this? what is the intentionality behind it? I had to be so intentional and so explicit, right? I'm not doing this because I want you to like chug and churn something. I'm doing this because I want to know what your thoughts are on Their Eyes Are Watching God and how you can support those thoughts with a primary or secondary source. I want to know what your thoughts are on Fahrenheit 451 and why you think it's a relevant text for us to teach in 2025. And when I make it that explicit, then they're like, oh, okay, well, she wants to know my thoughts. She wants to know what I think. Now I have to write it. I have to be invested and engaged. And then I have to offer them time in class to do it. You said so many of our students are already living in the real world, right? They're already doing the thing where they're engaged in, childcare and work and 8 other classes or 7 other classes. So if I want them to think deeply, I have to not only model it for myself, right, in class, but I also have to give them time and look over what they're writing and direct them in the moment. And that means like fewer assessments and a lot more time spent with them like doing the things in front of me and us building something together.
There's so much to unpack from that, right? Like I think about Wendy and Roy as freshmen in the piece at university, and to think they were in a system, that valued rigor, which in this context meant like more and
Rigor.
more severity. Yeah, like to be at the highest echelons, to get into Columbia University, right? You just need to do more, better, faster, whatever. And apparently that's what AI does really well.
Yeah.
Because that's what those students did. And then in college, they modeled those activities. What they didn't have, was a model of an adult, an educator who can not just tell them what to do, but do that alongside them, to not just be a model of academic content and processes and skills, but a model of a person who isn't going to use these tools to.
And a model of a student, right? A learner,
Yes.
Somebody who's actively grasping concepts. I tell my students all the time, all of my courses in college were literature based. I did not take a single composition class because like I got AP credit or whatever for that. And so the last year of my life has been me buried in these composition texts, taking notes, learning, and then doing it with them, doing it live. And so, yeah, a lot of the times I'm like, guys, I have not written an annotated bibliography in longer than I'm going to admit to any of you. But, and when I did, I can't guarantee that it was good because I didn't know how to do it. And so now what I'm attempting to teach you is a framework so that you can figure it out, or outlining. I am a terrible outliner. I suck at it. I have ADHD. For a long time, it was untreated. And so sitting down this year and being like, okay, I'm going to read this rubric. I'm going to read this set of expectations, and I'm going to outline it with you. And this is what my brain does. And this is how I would throw it up there. How would you guys throw it up there? And sometimes I would put it together and outline and it sucked. And my kids were like, this doesn't match this, lady. You're doing something different. And I was like, correct. Okay.
Welcome to the process.
Yeah, exactly. And so like modeling what it's like to learn how to do things. And what we learned is that for me, I'm a voice noter. As you can tell, I'm a yapper. I have a shirt that says professional yapper. And so all of my outlines were done in voice notes. So I would just like put it in voice notes. It would translate, or it would give me a transcript, and I would throw that into a doc. And so then I had this thing and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. I found my way. But we had a lot of iterations of that. And so they watched me suck it up, and they watched me like write a paper and then go back to the outline and be like, these are very different things. Or they watched me like write a whole draft, and then nothing about it was salvageable or interesting until the last paragraph. So I got rid of all of that. They watched me go through those processes, and they were like, oh, this is actually just hard. And that was such a huge moment for them. They're like, oh, you have 2.5 degrees. You are, applying to PhD programs. You're still not an expert at this. And it's like, no, because like, unless you write all the time, every day, and unless you figure out processes that work for you, and sometimes they do change, right? Like if I'm writing a literary analysis, that looks very different than I'm writing a personal narrative, which looks very different than if I'm writing, something in science. But something that I told them to do is in every single thing that they're doing, they took a stats class. Some of them had economics. Where are you? Where are you fitting into this? If you're writing a lab, where is your interest in this? What do you think is going to be the most fascinating moment of this experiment? Where are you like extremely excited or extremely underwhelmed, right? That is the stuff that I think personalizes it. What were your expectations, right? What were how was your hypothesis different than what came to fruition? I was like, those are you. Those moments are you, because all of those things come from your brain and your experiences. And so, yeah, I totally took off on a tangent just to say that like my goal in my classroom is always to be the lead student. And that is what has essentially changed, right? I'm no longer a constant facilitator. I am the thought partner. You want to use AI? Talk to me. Let's talk through it. Let's figure it out. And I have had to step back and make sure that my what I incorporate into that conversation doesn't do exactly what I think AI is doing. So I make them talk through it, and they will go in circles for a while before I'm like, have you thought of, because I too, as educators, we want to fix things just like AI. And so I've had to step back and be like, okay, let's think about it. Let's think about it. What does that mean? Okay. And they hate it. They absolutely hate it. They're like, could you just give me the answer? No, I can't give you the answer. We're doing a thing. We're doing a thing. And that's my motto. We're doing a thing. We're doing a thing. And so, yeah, my job has changed. And instead of attempting to get them to write the best paper or the best version of a paper, it's the process. And I say that as someone who used to, is this a safe space? Can I say this? I'm going to say this.
This is a safe space.
Okay. This is not, you're going to judge me a little bit, and that's okay.
A little bit.
It's okay. I'm judging me too. My first 2 years teaching, if I opened your document and I saw that it was not properly formatted, or I saw like 3 errors within the first like 30 seconds, I would send it back. I was like, no, not doing it. You didn't do it. And there were a lot of tears, and I thought I was being like cool and a hard ass. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to curse on the podcast. I thought I was being cool and like rigorous, and those students got good at MLA formatting, but that doesn't mean that they were better thinkers. Now I get papers that are less polished because we spent time on these beautiful, thoughtful, intriguing ideas. And so by the time students turn things into me, I would probably argue that they needed another round of revising or editing. But I know that everything in those papers is like theirs, and it is thoughtful. And I've seen it from, the first moment where it was coming into fruition to this point. And so that's something too. My expectations have changed of myself and of them.
It's almost like we have to step back and just reevaluate, like, what's the purpose of this entire project together?
What's the
right?
purpose?
Why are we here? What is the end goal of this course? In a world where AI can write anything, who cares? I want to care about what you can do, whether that's in an disciplinary English class, social studies, whatever. And maybe that does just involve a redefinition of rigor away from those previous ones in terms of severity and more of something, or like a more complex rubric or whatever that you can just plug into the chat bot. But maybe a redefinition of rigor in a more humanized context is really like about depth and breadth and connectivity, a responsibility to yourself and stewardship towards like a community. And maybe that sounds vibes based. But again, I think in a world where AI can do everything, well, that means we have an additional responsibility to do more human things, more better. And if that involves, slowing down in the classroom, perhaps covering less, doing fewer assessments, but they're more rigorous in a redefined human context, meaning it's authentic for students. You've modeled the process with them. They understand how to think and communicate by the end of it, rather than have the AI do the thinking and communicating for them. That to me sounds like a more sustainable educational system and a more humanized vision for classroom rigor than the alternative, which is get into an Ivy League school, having had ChatGPT do all of your work for you in high school, and now being here where the stakes are even higher and perhaps the financial costs are so much more burdensome, and you're trapped, right, with no skills, with no aptitudes or habits having been developed. You've just checked the box. Congratulations. Where has that gotten you?
The no skills thing scares me, The no skills
Yeah.
thing scares me. I hear a lot of professionals, teachers and otherwise, journalists, analysts saying, well, we're using AI. We have to teach them how to use AI. What I don't think people understand is that the people who are using AI in their fields have had whole careers without AI, right? If a student cannot do something without AI, they don't have that skill. And so what we're about to get is a bunch of people who are new to fields who never learned how to do the things. And that's very different than someone making a decision to utilize systems that can alter or change or shortcut, right? I think that there's a huge difference. As an educator, I tried the AI thing. I was like, we're gonna write a paper, we're gonna do it, and we're gonna use AI. And this was before last year, and was kind of the impetus for my no AI policy. And what I found was that the students who didn't have the skills wrote crap. It was crap. It was terrible. And because what we're asking them to do is we're asking them to write about things and think about things that they didn't think about to begin with, right? I want you to write about an idea that you didn't even have. And that's what scares me, right? When we're looking at Wendy in this article, she's just like, I utilize AI to outline. And I'm like, I understand, because I hear people who are awesome teachers talking about using AI to outline. And what I don't understand is what happens when Wendy doesn't have the skills to outline. What happens when she can't do that? Now, what have we left her with at an Ivy League institution? And then what happens when AI becomes like a pay for play, as it's becoming a situation where you can use the free version, but it's going to give you crap that you can't rely on, or you can pay for the, expansive pack that's going to give you something that it looks right now. So again, I think that this is another form of giving our students who are the most marginalized and the most in need a Band-Aid on and in place of skills and in place of what we like. Why are we here? And I have to sit with that often. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? And being able to articulate that, I think, is something that educators in the K through 12 space are really good at. But I don't necessarily know that a lot of our colleagues in higher ed are really good at, right? Because it's like, I don't want to start a beef. I just want to throw that. That's not the point of this is not the higher ed versus K through 12. I just think that I know, as somebody who's been in academic spaces, getting a bachelor's degree and then a master's and then another master's and then applying for PhD programs, all of them, there are a lot of professors who are like, you're doing this because this is what we do. You're doing this because this is what people who get this degree do. And it's like, well, but why? And I asked one of my professors, who is a big deal in the space that I'm currently working in. I was like, can I have a rubric for this? Because what are you grading on? And he goes, we don't use rubrics in grad school. I was like, I have a master's degree. That's not true. I'm just, okay, whatever. And so I got an 83 or something, and it was vibes. It was just based on vibe. That's really vibe. He was just like, I just an 83. And I didn't get much feedback other than I had some weird sentence things. But it wasn't even, there was nothing in the very brief explanation that was about grammar or mechanics. And I did it in AMLA instead of APA. And I lost 10 points for that. But he couldn't explain to me why we were doing it. And so it was really interesting to me. And that was a light bulb moment where I was like, I don't ever want to do that. I don't ever want to be that teacher. And I think that if we have to step back and be like, why are we doing this? It's not about AI proofing as much as it's about thinking about, what do I want students to put in, and what do I want students to get out? And then articulating that and bridging that gap, right? And the idea that rigor is more and harder and better and faster is so absurd, because I read some of the most beautifully articulated, beautifully formatted papers that I've ever read in 10 years. And we talked a lot about our feelings and about how we relate to characters. And it's not separate. And I think that your work in humanizing education and humanizing humans is so important, because that stuff's hard. When my students had to present their research to their peers and to the school board and to the principal, They had to stand in front of like a tripod and be like, hey, this is what I did my research on. This is why it's important. And a question that they had to answer for everyone is, how does this relate back to your community? That was the hardest thing they did all semester. And they all said that. Not the research where they could have like pumped it in or copied and pasted an abstract. No, it was like relaying that information into a natural audience of people who would be impacted by the change that you want to see. That was hard. That was rigorous. And it was amazing.
You can't fake that. The chatbot can't tell you what the community connection is, no matter how much context you put into it.
Right.
All of the previous conversation has been so valuable just to unpack that landscape and explore that space together and, kind of craft a humanizing vision, right? It always sounds so cheesy, like so cliche to be like restoring humanity to education. But then, like I always say too, what more higher purpose is there? Is it about credentials and jobs or whatever? Well, like clearly now in an AI environment, we know chatbots do those things better. But what are the things that humans, right, are capable of creating together, and how do we shift spaces towards that? I think the strength of what I'm hearing you say about how you had to be really responsive to students and their needs and that context to respond, to build an alternative to the AI chatbot driven future. And I think in higher education, to your point, they're so stuck in this is the way that it is, they're not going to be responsive to students, which is what they need to do to beat the chatbot. But instead, they're going to, name and shame and blame students for, being in that environment. Anyway.
I don't think that the academy is a space for student responsiveness, right? I think that this is kind of like the whole purpose of what you're doing. And I think that there are educators, especially if you go to any education department at any university, they'll tell you, right? They know because they've been creating rubrics and they've been looking at their assessments and being like, is this what I want to do? I think that the lack of pedagogical expertise in institutions of higher ed is a huge problem, because when you ask a professor for a rubric, if they don't know what they're looking for, they cannot give you one. If you ask a professor, why are we doing this? If they haven't thought critically about what purpose their assessments or assignments serve, then they can't give you one. But there also has to be some sort of overhaul of this like idea that I'm there to like pass on this like generational knowledge and I'm bestowing upon the people who are deserving. And by deserving, I mean they can afford it. There has to be this overhaul of what higher education does. And I think that the priority has to be not just on the students as products, but on the students as humans, and also on the educators, right? How many of my history professors had sat through a lecture on best practices for, delivering even even when they're giving us information, right? How do brains learn? How do brains get information and retain information and then utilize that information? I don't think that any of those people knew that. And that's not their fault, but I definitely think it's the responsibility of the people who are doing it now for students who could just Google whatever they're saying to say, hey, this is why this is important. This is why this is assignment's important. This is how it relates back to the world that we're living in now. I think that we just have to be extremely explicit. And I think that, again, K through 12 teachers are good at that because students will absolutely ask questions. If I have to be here, you're going to answer my questions, right? So many of my students are like, we're both here. We're both here for the next 45 minutes. So you got to figure something out, lady. And I'm like, you're right. And I think that we have to be responsive because students have to be there and we have to deal with it. But I think it's different when you don't feel an obligation in the same way to ensuring that your students understand the purpose of being there.
Yeah, there's always been tension in the K-12 system as far as it relates to like the preparation for the next level, right? How is this preparing kids for college? How is this? But now I think that the real tension, maybe there's this AI divide, right? Where K-12 has a real opportunity to be a lot more responsive to students in this. And I think institutions of higher ed are embracing AI as a labor-saving device. And I think there's going to be a lot of tension then in kids making that transition.
But that's removed from like the human element too, right? Because I think institutions, right? Like presidents and chancellors are like, yes, cool, we've got this way to save money. But then you've got like actual professors who are like, no, I actually care about this. I really want them to learn things. I don't have the tools to teach them in a way that subverts these systems. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be learned about like the people on the ground actually doing the work of educating and how much more we have in common than we have separate.
And maybe this is a good off ramp into solutions, be they like idealized magic wands or some of the things like you've been modeling in your classroom practice. So there's probably a lot we could apply this kind of thought experiment to. So I'm not saying this was the only thing that we would fix if we had a magic wand, but if you could wave a magic wand and change something about the relationship of AI to education, if you swooped in and tapped that, what would it be?
It would be that we would just stop. We would just stop. I am so blown away by how quickly our education systems have just adapted this thing that we're supposed to put in front of kids. It's not tested. It is not research based. It's not research backed. We are just like, AI, here you go. That blows my mind because I can't think of, I mean, I can think of a lot of things that we do this for, but it's just so mind blowing that so many people are like writing and publishing books before we even have any sort of concrete information about how this impacts the trajectory of our students' education. So, like, I'm not saying that we stop AI. Like, I that's not, we're obviously not going to put the genie back in the bottle, as people keep telling me. But I think that every single person who works with students needs to think critically about what we're doing and where we got the idea that this was best practice and where we got the idea that this was like a foregone conclusion. And like, where's that narrative coming from? Who's selling us? Is it Microsoft? It's Microsoft. I know that for us, it's Microsoft. Microsoft is telling us that we all need Copilot, right? But like, what are we doing? I'm not trying to make an enemy out of Microsoft either. But what I'm saying is it's like,
everybody's going to be coming for you. Just pitchforks and torches at the end of this. Chanea!
I'm blown away. I'm going to be blown away by the responses. But what I'm saying is it's like, educators are some of the most stubborn people I know. Like, I still can't get some of the people in my building to like put toner into the copy machine, right? I'm still okay, I'm just fighting with everybody. I'm still fighting that battle on some fronts. So how is it that we have easily convinced so many people that AI is the way or the future without giving teachers proper training, without giving us proper research, without giving us any sort of like model for the guardrails? We've just like thrown ourselves into this thing without any sort of like, hey, what are we doing? What's the end game? What's the end goal? Are we making ourselves obsolete? What are we doing here? And I think that, so I would just pause it. If I had a magic wand, I would say, stop. We're going to stop and we're going to start thinking about every assignment as, every activity as, what is my goal? What do I want? How can I relay this better? I think that everyone would just have time and energy to think about what we're already doing and what's ineffective and why do we need AI so badly, right? What is it that we are saving time for? And are we actually allocating that time to things that are more beneficial? I think that you have posed that question a couple times. Like, what are we doing? It's time saving for what? And then
what are we saving all that time for?
Right. And where is that time going now that we have it? Like now that we have this miraculous amount of time, like what are we doing with it?
Yeah, it's going to save all of the time that we have to then do the other things that we don't have the skills and time to do. I guess I just don't know what we're saving all this time for. If there's anything to be slow and inefficient and iterative and messy, right? It's got to be learning. It's got to be education. I want the other things to be efficient. You know, I want surgery to be efficient. I want, I don't know, laundry, right? Where's AI
for laundry?
Right. I want all of my chores to be efficient. But man, the thinking dishes, and the reading.
What's going on?
Yeah. And the the discussion. And I want that to be the messy human stuff because I think that's fun and cool. And I think that's kind of what we're here to do on this planet, not to just bank all of our time for some, I don't know, unknown future that's not going to come.
And when we think about like the people that we revere, even in like this like super white colonialist project that is like American education, like the people who are the pinnacles of like our thought or institutions, those people were thinkers. They were writers, right? And we're reading their writing. And some of our students are, putting their writing through AI. And like, that's not the people that we revere and the things that we say that we value. Those people were doing messy, hard thinking. MLK was like writing all of the time and preaching and like talking and teaching. Like these people were the philosophers Aristotle, like they're all thinkers. And the fact that we're trying to subvert that with the people that we're supposed to be teaching makes me sad. Also, AI is bad for the environment. I don't think we talk about that enough. And I just wanted to say, if no one else has said it to you, do some research about AI and the environment. I told my boss the other day, I was like, you could have just Googled that. And he was like, but AI. And I'm like, you know that you just like, you're just using like the amount of water as like however many Google searches. I'm like, but because people, and he was like, I legit didn't know. I didn't know.
Which is wild to me. I think that was probably new information like in early 2024 or something,
Right.
when that was the impact was kind of come. But I felt like that's old news now. So it's interesting to encounter people in the wild who haven't necessarily had that critical thought about like, oh, technology's environmental impact. But
no, and I think that that's very intentional. I think that you and I know, right? Because we are researchers. We do a lot of reading. We do a lot of talking to people who think about this stuff. But people who don't, I think that path has been intentionally like quieted because like if you know that you're doing something kind of harmful, then I think most people would be like, I'm at least going to pump the brakes.
yeah, no, it's the whole ecosystem is designed to obfuscate those costs and to make them hidden. There's a lot of hidden human labor, things that were pitched as being the latest and greatest in AI. 6 months later, you find out, no, it was human labor the whole time. That was, watching cameras to make sure that people grab the right items from, the checkerless grocery store, or, they were human beings controlling a robot behind the scenes. It wasn't an AI operated thing. So, not just environmental impact, but a real human impact to all these things as
You've got
well. So
people watching the cameras at your checkout stations at grocery stores, right? Pressing those buttons. Like it's not just, you're right, it's human. It's humans.
You don't have to think about the cost, because it costs you nothing. But of course, we know that there's no such thing as a free lunch in this sense. So there was an energy, there's a labor, there's something hidden on the system side. So your magic wand, to quote Rob Van Winkle, is stop, collaborate, and listen.
Exactly. That's exactly.
So I think in the absence then, barring magic wands and wishes, what can students, teachers, and schools do differently instead to help build a different future?
I think that as educators, we need to be really honest with ourselves and with our students about what our intentions are, what our limitations are, right? I cannot assign 13 different writing pieces in a semester if I don't want to use some sort of like outside intervention to help me grade. I have to be very realistic and I have to be I have to be intentional. And I think that for students, right, I think that they need to be empowered to ask questions, right? They need to be something that my students do not lack is empowerment, right? They will ask questions about anything. Why? Why did you say this? For what? No. I have you voice recorded. When you said this, and I'm like, okay, fine. So I have to explain myself so often. But I created a space to do that. And so we need to create a space where student voice and student ideas and the messiness, those things are valued. And I think that starts with like building level principles, right? Talking to your teachers. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Because if it is in service of an essay or a 54 question test, like the STAR test in Texas, where they are going to get a number of questions right or wrong, and then their essay is going to be graded by AI and that determines whether or not they graduate high school, if that's the end game, then okay, maybe AI is what your students should be using, right? If that's the value that your building, that your district, that your institutions have placed on education, then some of the students have got it right. Right? They know they've decoded the game and they're doing exactly what we expect them to do. But if the value is on citizenry, if the value is on thought, if the value is on articulation and the ability to be in community with other people, then I think that building level administrators, district level administrators, educators, department chairs, everyone, and students, and then home adults, right? I think that that's a big part of it too. We need to come together and think about what we value as a community and how are those values showing up in our classroom. If we say that we value student voice, then like outsourcing student voices to a machine is nonsensical. If we say that we value community voice, then like not getting community voice and instead like generating something about what we think the community represents, nonsensical. We need to start like practicing what most of our mission and vision statements say that we preach.
Amen. Every word is golden, Chanea. My goodness, Chanea, this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being the first person to take me up on my offer. I got like 4 other people who were like, "Can you come on a pod?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, I'm busy. I'm booked now. I'm sorry." Sorry.
I'm in the green room with the Human Restoration Project.
Yeah, we're doing a whole thing. It's fine. No, but I was definitely like, I want to talk to someone whose work I admire on, social media, but also like in the real world, like the work of like talking about and really getting to the nitty gritty about the human component, because without even thinking about it, I think that that's what my work has been the last year, especially, right? How do we make this more human? How do we make this more humane? And I think that that's so important in a time when the dehumanization of people is so systemic and so in our faces. It is so important to talk about like the humanness and the ways in which our students are the humans who are most impacted, but also like most likely to be able to make a change and to make a difference. And even if it's on this like tiny scale where you're just talking to one person about your semester long research, right? That's a moment where you have had the opportunity to use your education to change someone's mind or to sway someone. And those moments cannot be, thrown into a machine. And I will also say this, I guess the one thing that I didn't get to say is that teaching since November the 5th has been hard. It has been so hard because I am, as I'm sure you can tell, like I'm a pretty hopeful and optimistic person, but it is hard to convince students who are from multiple marginalized identities and communities that like this is a worthy process and this is a worthy project, right? Why do I need to think if like the bad guys are going to win? Why do I need to think if my neighbors are like voting against my best interest? Why would I want to give back to a community where the majority of people have voted to keep my family in this position of precarity? I have had to think through all of those questions that were asked to me directly or indirectly so often, right? Who cares? Who cares if I chat GPT my way through this? Because like, I just need a job so that I can protect my family, or I just need to get some sort of economic or social security so that, if my little brother has to go to the hospital, I don't have to, like my mom doesn't have to like not be able to be there to sit with him. These are real life questions. And for a long time, I was like, I don't know. I don't know what the purpose is. I know that this all sucks. And I know that, I don't know what your duty and responsibility is to a community that you feel has betrayed you. I don't know. But I do know that your ideas cannot be different than anyone else's. And going back to Audre Lorde, the dreams that we feed our children cannot be different if our dreams are stagnated and if our realities are altered by an algorithm. And so I just think it's important that we as educators and as humans, like remember that what we put into our writing and into our thoughts, those things take root somewhere, right? And if we don't have any thoughts or we don't have any ideas, then that's taking root too. And we're still being fed things, right? We're still on TikTok and Twitter and all these other, never X, always Twitter. We're still on these places, getting information, consuming things. But it's like how and why, and then what do we do with that? That is like the point of education now, I think.
Is that all?
That's all.
There is this sense, and this existed before, obviously, right? But now when the dehumanization is almost totalizing, right? The dehumanizing messages coming from every single sector of public and private life, where, again, precarity is in the hands of, your job might be in the hands of one person. The future of medical research might be in the hands of a single person. The country is definitely moving in a particular direction right now. And I think there is a lot of power in sort of a intentional, humanizing resistance to that, that says we're not going to participate in these systems anymore because we're going to build a more humanizing social system, right? Community-focused social system. We're going to build a humanized education. We're going to build, a humanized political system. Just like what is the vision of all of that, right? How can we actually provide a vision that's counter to those totalizing, dehumanized narratives if we don't offer better off-ramps, that value people within these systems? Anyway, I appreciate your words about that. And I think it just has, the last 10 months have highlighted just the salience and the importance of, what does it mean to restore humanity to education? We're all participating in that project together, whether we like it or not. Thank you so much, Chanea.
Thank you.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast at Human Restoration Project. I hope this conversation leaves you inspired and ready to start making change. If you enjoyed listening, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast player. Plus, find a whole host of free resources, writings, and other podcasts all for free on our website, humanrestorationproject.org. Thank you.